present you some experimental findings related to individual differences in children's written irony comprehension. And this is work that I've done with Tuomo Häikiö from University of Turku, Finland, Matti Laine from Open Academy University, and Pexman from Western University, Canada. Oh, sorry, Canada. And this was part of my Research Council of Finland project. So again, I try not to just say the same things again in my talk, but again, for the sake of this presentation, defining irony as or verbal irony as utterance expressing opposite of literal meaning is quite enough. What I didn't say in my keynote is that there is a debate on what irony really is, or what is included in irony. There is all kinds of some see that there are other aspects that don't fit into this definition, but we can maybe talk it in another context, and maybe there are better experts in the audience to talk about this actually than I am. And irony, or traditional theories in irony, assume that ironic language would take longer to process and harder to comprehend than literal language, at least under special circumstances. So when the irony is not supported by context, which is often not, because part of the use of irony is that it's kind of a surprise. And Rachel Giora successed in her theory that more familiar ironies would be easier to process, and she talks about lexicalizes ironic utterances like "yeah, right" kind of utterances, but there are not that many of those in real life. So that again leads us to the point that in most cases, irony is harder to process and harder to comprehend and slower to process. And more recent theories like predictive coding theory and parallel constraint satisfaction theory assume that individual differences in cognitive and emotional abilities affect the ease of irony processing. Irony processing in adults have been shown to be harder to comprehend and slower to process. And as I showed in the keynote, it is characterized by increased later rereading of ironic utterances. Adults also saw trial effects, so the processing of irony changes during the course of the experiment. Spotorno and Novak call this early-late effect, but we call in our studies this trial effect. But if you see studies using early-late effect, it's the same thing. And as I already showed, there are individual differences in ironic comprehension, for example, related to better emotional abilities. And these are related to shorter reading times for ironic phrases. And children can typically determine non-literal meaning of irony by age of 6, and at the early stage accuracy is low. And it seems that the final things that develop in the development of, or course of development of ironic comprehension are understanding the humor and teasing functions, which seems to develop until later adolescence. 10-year-olds written irony comprehension accuracy is lower than adults, and variance in children's irony comprehension is large. Like you can see in the figure on the right-hand side, the blue circles are individual children's average irony comprehension accuracy. And we have got it from this specific figure all those who have 0 irony comprehension, but there is basically everything in between 0 comprehenders to 100% comprehenders among 10-year-old children. So the variance is as large as it can be. However, the processing patterns are very adult-like, and also children show trial effects. There is a slight differences in reading patterns, so children tend to do more first pass rereading than later rereading than adults. And this is related to reading development. So in general, children still at the age of 10 rely more on first pass reading than later reading. Although, again, they start to resemble more adults at that age, and they also show different processing patterns or adult-like processing patterns in their read. Nicholson et al. And Dennis et al. In their studies have shown that children's higher empathy was associated with faster judgment of speakers' intent, ironic intent, and higher comprehension accuracy. So it's fair to assume that empathy, skill, and ironic comprehension are related, at least based on these studies. And as irony comprehension requires to suppress the literal meaning and maintain relevant contextual information in accessible state, so the contextual information and the phrase itself, it's been suggested and shown studies by adults that working memory capacity and irony comprehension correlate with each other, or processing patterns rather than comprehension on adults. It doesn't correlate with comprehension per se. But in children, there is one previous study that have shown that irony comprehension accuracy correlates with working memory capacity, and also studies that have measured more general executive functions have found relation between higher executive functions and irony comprehension. So in our experiment, we investigated how 10-year-old children's level of empathy skill and working memory are related to their processing and comprehension of wit and irony. We expected that higher empathy and working memory would lead to more accurate and faster irony comprehension. In our study, we combined data from 2 previous studies using the same experimental setup. This resulted in 97 Finnish-speaking children that were a bit over 10 years old, so 10 years and 4 months in average. And they had, at the time of testing, 3 years and 3 months of formal reading instruction, or they had received. And the data was collected in 6 different classrooms in 3 different schools in Turku and all regions in Finland. And we used SR Research iLink eye trackers to collect the data. And to give you an idea how our materials look like, this is a translation from Finnish. The materials don't look as maybe convincing when they are translated in English, but you have to take my word that they work in Finnish. And so here what I want you to notice that the literal and ironic version of different stories only differed by critical context, which made the following target phrase either literal or ironic. And otherwise, the experimental items were exactly the same. And after reading of each of these texts, each participant saw comprehension questions. So did Alexi think that Onni was hungry? And text memory question to see whether they have really read the text or not. And we measured and controlled children's technical reading skill, their general reading comprehension ability. Then we measured their working memory capacity using DigitSpan from Vehlert's intelligence scale for children, and empathy skill using empathy index for children and adolescents. And what we found out, so here in x-axis, you can see trial order. So here, 0 value, this is centered. So 0 value means midpoint of the experiment, and minus values mean beginning of the experiment, and plus values end part of the experiment. And empathy skill was fitted into the statistical models as continuous variables, but here for the illustration purposes, I have divided in high and low, so it's a +1 standard deviation from average and minus standard deviation from average. And blue dashed line is irony comprehension, and red line is a comprehension for literal. And as we can see, children showed roof effect, so near perfect accuracy for literal text, and it was unrelated to their empathy skill. Low empathy skill readers, so -1 SD there, although there was a slight increase toward the end of the experiment, but pretty much they stayed there. High empathy skill readers started also at the guessing level, but their irony comprehension accuracy increased around 73% level toward the end of the experiment. So they were able to improve their performance. As for the working memory capacity, again, the figure itself works very similarly, but here, low working memory capacity readers, or the -1 SD here, they showed improvement in their irony comprehension, whereas high working memory capacity readers not. So this is opposite of what we expected. As for the reading, so probability to look back to target phrase, similarly to the adults data that I showed earlier in the keynote, children showed higher probability to look back to ironic than literal target phrase in the beginning of the experiment, but the effect turned other way around. When we look the probability to look back to critical context, which was the sentence that made the phrase ironic or literal, we can see the same kind of pattern in there as well. Here in the x-axis, you can see empathy skill, and we can see that low empathy skill, so minus values there, or readers with lower empathy skill, they showed higher probability to look back to target phrase, ironic than literal target phrase, and when the empathy skill increases, so turns from minus values to plus values, the effect turns other way around. But I want you to notice here that although this happens, it seems that ironic processing probability to look back to the ironic target phrase stays pretty much the same, but the probability to return to literal phrases actually increases. As for the working memory capacity, we see that during the first pass reading, so the A1 is first pass reading time and B1 is first pass rereading fixations, but it correlates with reading time, so it's basically that. And then there are correct and incorrect. So whether the children answered the comprehension question correctly or incorrectly. And then here we can see that when the children answered correctly to the comprehension question, low working memory capacity readers then show higher processing times, higher first pass reading times for ironic than literal phrases. And the effect starts to turn other way around when working memory capacity increases. And when they answered to the comprehension question incorrectly, low working memory capacity children show basically no irony effect, but the high working memory capacity children show it. So they spend longer time of reading ironic target phrase, which is quite interesting. So to conclude, children's processing times were very similar to the previous studies and are overall very adult-like. As predicted, empathy was related to higher comprehension and marginally more efficient processing of written irony, which is consistent with previous studies in children and eye-tracking studies in adults. An increase in empathy skill increases also the likelihood of later rereading of literal phrases. However, so it seems that the absence of emotional intent in literal contexts may require additional verification to confirm the interpretation. So they kind of expect there to be something, but when it's not there in literal phrases, they need to verify this. This is at least our interpretation for the results at the moment. It seems that empathy helps children to better recognize the emotional intent behind irony, which serves as an additional cue that makes irony easier to understand. And empathy seems not to help children at the beginning of the experiment, but gets better when they get exposed to it. And this might be related to higher expectation of literal language. So when they start, they have kind of higher expectation that there will be literal text only, and they rely more on literal interpretation. And when the experiment goes on, this changes. Working memory capacity was related to processing and comprehension of irony, but the direction of this effect was unexpected. It is possible that children with high working memory capacity were able to consider more interpretive options, and because they are lacking experience in irony per se, it made them more confused, and because of that, they failed in their comprehension. And maybe this is also the case why when low working memory capacity readers, they were overall slower in their reading. And then this eventually led to better comprehension. Okay, thank you again for your attention. And this paper, the paper on this got just accepted to Journal of Child Language. And then if you are more interested in the whole study and then all the results that we found, please check the preprint or wait for the actual paper.